Good morning, everyone. My name's Cheryl Van Dalen Smith. I'm the Associate Dean Academic here at York University's Faculty of Grad Studies. I'm here with my colleague Tracy Bula, who is the manager of our new Graduate Supervision Support Hub, and with our Associate Director of Academic Affairs, Wesley Moyer. I'm so thrilled that you've signed up for this of our first Supervision Hub workshop, where we decided on purpose to focus on your well-being as supervisors. And we have invited one of the most prominent authors around supervisor well-being, Dr. Gina Wisker. I wanted to tell you just a little bit about our Supervision Hub, and that if you'd like to stay in touch with us, we have a closing slide where you can stay connected, because we have a variety of other workshops planned that we plan to extend to our partner universities across the province and nationally. We're pleased to introduce to you today then internationally renowned supervisory expert, Professor Gina Wisker, author of the Good Supervisor and the Postgraduate Research Handbook. Dr. Wisker currently serves as a doctoral supervisor and professor in the International Center for Higher Education Management at the University of Bath. She is a professor at the University of the Arctic in Norway, a visiting professor at Anglia Ruskin University, Cambridge, and an emeritus professor at the University of Brighton. Dr. Wisker researches, writes, supervises, and teaches in both higher ed and literature. She's published 26 books and over 150 articles, including, as I said, The Good Supervisor, a key resource to us at York University. And so with that, I'd like to turn to Dr. Wisker. And our plan for today is Dr. Wisker is going to speak for about a half an hour. We're then going to, because it's a workshop, move into breakout rooms where we have some case studies to unpack, where we're thinking about supervisor well-being. We'll bring you back and do a bit of a debrief and report. And then Dr. Wisker has some practical ideas about keeping us well in this role. So over to you, Gina, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. And hello, and thanks for turning up today. I hope this is going to be useful to you. Just to give you a little bit of background about me, at the moment I've got 25 doctoral students on 3 days a week. I'll pause at that point and share the screen because that's clearly unsustainable. Okay. So if somebody could tell me that you can definitely see that.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. There's quite a lot of work around looking at doctoral student well-being, but very little still, even since 3 of us did some work about 10 years ago, over 10 years ago now, some of it, on well-being and supervision and strategies for us as supervisors so that we can stay well and also do good work with our students. So that's really what I'm looking at today. And I'm going to share a couple of pieces of research, one of which has been published, and you've got the link, well, they've both been published. One was a report, and the other one is an article, which you've got the link to at the end, so that you can read a bit more about what we found out in our work. Just try and move this on. There we are. So we're going to think a bit about well-being and supervision. And the main finding from the work that we did in 2011 and 2016 was that supervisor well-being is tied to student progress. And that might not be a surprise to you, because it isn't a surprise to me in a sense that if my students are not doing well, or if they're stuck, or if they're very unhappy with their work, or I can clearly see that it's not moving, then I feel implicated, and I feel quite worried, and my well-being is affected by that. So that major finding was that we are very tied up with their progress and their happiness. And so we really want to be working to support them, but we need to support ourselves, because we won't be able to support anybody if we're too worried about what we're doing and we're feeling unwell and lost and unstructured. So we're going to think about some strategies for resilience and well-being for the students, but mainly for the supervisors, but these are necessarily connected. And we're going to think about making this sustainable, which will lead to suggestions about communities and about changing some of our own practices. You've got a chance to look at some case studies of real people with real problems, and I'm sure you've got some of your own that you'll be thinking about. So supervisor well-being, written about very little. We did a major piece of work in 2016 and found these direct links between supervisors feeling well and positive mental health and well-being in relation to the movement forward and the intellectual success of their students. So I want you to keep that in mind and keep some of your students in your head all the way through this session today. And recognizing this link and mitigating against feeling low and powerless if a student isn't moving forward successfully, I think is a key, along with all the information that we all get on well-being about exercise, breaking blocks and so forth, to our supervisor mental health and well-being. So it's recognizing this connection and also putting in place all the usual kind of mental health well-being things. For example, I take the dog around the park now 4 times a day, partly to get away from the intense pressure of working on students' writing or talking to them as they're trying to tackle some of their own issues. So what are the characteristics of the doctoral journey then? They're on a doctoral journey. And I think that's a very stressful experience. And of course, it is for us as they go through these different steps and meet blockages and meet tough things to do. And there's an expectation of continued high achievement. And yet, what are they doing? They're doing something that's completely new. And so it's quite mystifying. They've seen other models, but they don't really know what their own model of a doctorate's going to look like and their own research journey is going to look like. And I think if our expectations, if the models we're working towards are quite mystifying and not made clear by somebody saying, look, try it this way or that way, or this is how it's been done by others, or you're stuck in this way. Let's find out how you might become unstuck. Then for the students, it sometimes becomes very isolating and very blocked. And then for us, it does, because we can see they're not making progress. It's a very long journey, and a lot of it's difficult to define. And they're testing themselves against something that's unknown practices and unknown outcomes. And many of my students are extremely confident and enormously successful in their senior management roles, but this is new. And it's tough for them not to be able to master it quite from the start. And it's tough for me working with advising them and also feeling how they must feel if they are stuck with their work. So I feel stuck when they feel stuck. So I want you to think for a minute, but not actually to speak about it. What causes you stress? Generally, of course, but also as a supervisor. So what affects your well-being and mental health? I mean, there could be all sorts of things. The university practices and regulations and expectations, the amount of the workload. I mentioned 25 students. That is clearly impossible. Interactions with students and other supervisors. Are they stressful or are they supportive? You've also got research and other commitments going on. And is there anything else? So what at the moment, particularly related to your role as a supervisor, is causing you stress and affecting your well-being and mental health? Keep that in your mind as we move on. And some of the things that people said in our research, here's an example of something. We tend to think about well-being in terms of its absence more than its presence. I mean, it's, the notion of well-being is a kind of default, and we notice when we move away from it. There's something about stress. I think where most people feel that they're not in a state of well-being, it's often to do with pressures and stresses on them. And that's interesting because if you look at the definition of well-being, it says it's about realizing potential and coping with the normal stresses of life. And I think that's probably the key, that we don't have a sense of well-being because the level of stress that we experience is more than we can easily cope with. And that's from the first project from 2011. And I notice the link with realizing potential, because our success and the students' success are very tied up together, and our potential is realized, and we feel a sense of self-actualization when they're doing well. And perhaps it shouldn't be quite that tight, but I think we're stuck with it. So our well-being and mental health and stress levels, as well as a sense of self-worth, are tied up with student progress and development. We need to see projects completed and students succeed and finish for their funding reasons and for their self-actualization, internal reasons. We're very capable and busy, and so are students, and they're one of our responsibilities. So while we're really focused on their success and their movement forward, we've got lots of other things to do. So how do we as supervisors know what to do to support our students and so relieve stress on ourselves? I think the unknown journey of the doctoral learning process and the research project itself, which doesn't really know what its outcome is at the beginning, have a number of stresses and complexities attached to this whole journey. So it isn't surprising that doctoral students working alone will suffer mental health issues and problems with their well-being. And some of this can be helped by supervisors clarifying the steps and stages of the journey with the students, and some by reducing the isolation through enabling the students to join communities. And some if they develop emotional resilience, so they can move towards a positive developmental learning experience and the achievement of the doctorate. And these same strategies support us as supervisors. In the UK, there's been quite a lot of large-scale projects looking at supporting students, doctoral students' well-being. But there hasn't been a big project, apart from the little one that Charlotte and I did and the little one that Jill and I did on supervisor well-being yet. And I think one of the expectations of the doctoral learning journey, as being an arrow straight journey upwards to achievement, is something which needs questioning. There's lots of blocks, there's lots of stuck places, there's lots of moments of questioning and moments of self-doubt along the way. And our students are going to get stuck, and then they'll suddenly have breakthroughs, and we're going to get stuck along with them. And normalizing and dealing with these setbacks and the self-doubt and offering some clear guidance and some clear stepping stones and models of successful writing and research to work towards will help make the doctoral journey a more manageable journey for them and less stressful, and then less stressful for us. So I just think there's this image that Gurr projects of this arrow going straight up from start to finish with success. And actually, there's lots of wobbly drop-off points and lots of stuck places when maybe your research hasn't turned out the way you expected it. Maybe you can't write, you've got a writing block. Maybe life's got in the way. This is for students. It's also for us. We're researching. And when they're stuck, we're stuck. So some of the literature suggests that graduate departments need to acknowledge the problem of student mental health and well-being. And some universities offer supervisors training on recognising, preventing and addressing mental health issues in their students and in themselves, but really actually very few focus on the supervisor's stress. And some universities talk about offering courses and workshops teaching yoga and mindfulness techniques. So there are general techniques for reducing stress that universities bring in place, and supervisors can take part of them. But an awful lot of them ignore the issues, like an awful lot of them ignore development and training and support for supervisors per se. I'm not being negative here. I'm just saying it as it is, I think, because really the focus is on the students, and quite rightly. But we won't be able to do our jobs properly with the students if we're also filled with self-doubt and feeling stressed. So some of the things then are about recognizing the issue, and they're also about looking after yourself and being realistic about the student journey and our own journeys with them. So I'll pause with that. That's a large piece of input to think about. And then I put together some suggestions based on this rather dire picture I've just painted for you about what's so tough for us because it's tough for the students. Some reflections on practice then. So what should we do? Well, you should be fully informed about and discover and use institutional information, regulations, published information on workload and expectations, and have all the rules and support structures of the doctoral college or whatever you've got, so you know who else you might turn to with structural and regulatory issues, and also with issues about students not moving on and feeling stuck and unhappy themselves. And you're a researcher, so I think one of the things you can do, one of the things I can do, is to research about the role. And there's lots of things in books, Anne Lee's book, Pam DeNicolo's book, things that I've written, to be informed about enabling and normal practices and to help you make decisions about how you manage your own workload and support students to do so. And so have a look at what's worked for other people. And start well. I had to learn from my own advice here. Really starting well with the students helps lay a much straighter path all the way through this supervisor relationship. So sharing with them about discussions about being planned and structured in interactions, and explaining when you're available, when you're not available. So managing your time, managing responsibilities, but also explaining the journey to them and offering models for it so they can see what does a proposal look like, what does an ethical submission look like, what does chapter 3, the literature review, look like, what does the methodology chapter look like, how do you round off with your conclusions. So I think making these things obvious and having upfront discussions about them, as well as upfront discussions about availability and how we can relate to each other and how we can meet regularly. And if you've got a second supervisor, and most of us do have, develop some positive agreements with them about how we're going to work together, because that can be a very supportive relationship, or it can be one that drags you down. What else? Well, we need to, oops, sorry, hang on. Help develop some issues, make visible some issues about coping with the few shock experiences and questionings which we might experience. Think about things that have gone wrong in your own experience and how you've had self-doubt and how you got over that. Mental health and well-being need to be engaged with right from the start of any supervision, and I think it's a discussion point with the students, but also boundaries, time, availability, expectations. If we can upfront these sorts of conversations as well as the research conversations, then I think there's time to make this manageable. We're often operating alone or in pairs with somebody that we don't know as co-supervisors. So there's an issue of matching understanding not only with a new student, but also with a co-supervisor. Some of my co-supervisors are amazing, and we work really well together. We talk about the students outside the supervisions, and some of them actually don't do anything at all, which is fine because at least they're not intruding on the activity. But I could do with a bit of support sometimes, and I'm sure the students want another voice. And that's just people. We're different, but I think it's good to have an open conversation about how you're going to work together to share the burden and the delight of working with a student and watching them develop. And in the early interactions and afterwards with students, there's a need to interpret each other's different learning approaches, work out how they learn. And one of my students overwrites enormously, and I constantly have to say, make it very clear, what are the 6 points? Now put them down. And others are very vague and not sure how to pinpoint what they're doing. Everybody's different. We need to get inside how they learn and support them, because otherwise we'll be spending a lot of time worrying about that and worrying about them not making progress and feeling that it's our fault. It's not our fault. Let's plan together. Let's work together. So it's important to work with an advisor on what the students started to construct, in very much in terms of the initial forms and then of those points along the milestones along the way, so that we keep focused in a manner that gives us proper information and enables us to work with proper models, so it is manageable. And have got conversations about high level thinking and breaking new ground, and congratulate the students and congratulate yourself that you were able to sustain that conversation about high level thinking, and you got enough engagement with their work to be able to match these thinking processes together. So being well planned, sharing development, sharing ideas together, that rewards us. It gives them a sense of progress, and it gives us a sense of progress. So a lot of planning, I think, goes into this, and then a lot of thinking about how individuals are learning and writing. So all the students we work with are different. They've all got different cognitive abilities, aims and intentions. And we have to think, how do we learn to work with all of this difference so that we can feel that we're competent and able to support them? So there's a lot of stepping back and thinking, what does this student particularly need? And how can I work well with them? And how can I deal with sometimes when they're over demanding or they're not making progress? So thinking about these and planning and sharing the ideas with others that you trust. So, since much of our health and well-being is attached to that sense of structure and competence, and also to being aware of the diversity of our students and the flexibility and the need for sound shared information, we need a repertoire of responses. So it doesn't really work to work with each student in exactly the same way. They are all thinking differently. Many of them come from quite different backgrounds. They're international students. They are neurodivergent. We've got all sorts of students in our doctoral student group. And we need a repertoire of responses, because then we will feel we're more in control, and then we'll also be able to see how they're making progress, and so are we. And we need to make sure the soundness of the suggestions that we make in relation to different needs and the development of the project. So establishing clear practices, access to information, regularity of meetings and exchanges, and a knowledge of where to direct the students and where to go ourselves should things become more complex and problematic. So know about regulations and support and communities. So summing up, really, starting well with flexibility, And flexibility that's set within confidence is something which is learned and practiced and nurtured in a good supervisor. You're not merely passing on what they did to a student and feeling annoyed if they don't turn out to be a clone of that supervisor. And these kind of issues about startup and momentum are important to get right, getting the ground rules right, giving them models to see what they're moving towards, although their work will be different. And then that will start to enable the students to get on with the work and reduce dependency. Because I think one of the great stresses is this dependency in a wilderness that some students experience and pass on to us because we don't have all the answers. Co-supervision and committees are very helpful. They can be. And it's important to establish good working relationships with our co-supervisors, our committee members, even though they're not going to be like us. They're not going to be like you and me. Everyone is different. So co-supervision is getting on with each other, being planned and agreed about who's going to do what, so that no one dominates and you take it in turns to make suggestions, engage with bits of the work, and you enable each other to make the most of your different strengths and skills. I work with a number of extremely talented other supervisors, some of whom I've known or I've admired for years. And I watch how we can interact and how they interact with a student and learn these good practices from them. But of course, there are a few who don't really engage, and that's a problem too. And I don't really know how to have the conversations with them to get them to engage more. So that's another worry. And we haven't really looked at that worry and researched it yet. So we need a mentally healthy co-supervisory journey alongside the student journey. And I think it's very rich and useful if we do work together well in committees and in co-supervision teams. The other thing that I found historically that's been helpful is setting up a supervisor community. So right in the early 2000s, a group of us were working with an international cohort, and we wanted to share good practice and share worries and come together. So I set up a supervisor community and we did some research together, and we also started talking online. It was quite early to be doing so. And people would post up ideas they have and problems they had, and then we'd come together and talk again. And a good supervisor community, which actually is really very rare, can take place in the university or your department. You can share experiences together. But also there are international supervisor communities. So there's all sorts of groups like the International Doctoral Education Research Network, where supervisors come together and talk about supervision. And the early special interests group, early is a European Association Research Learning and Instruction. And there will be Canadian ones, I expect, or US ones that you could join, where people will talk together and research together and share ideas and pains as supervisors. But for you personally, I recommend sticking to set hours, managing responses to students, except when they're in emergencies, and then maybe you step back and you go, okay, this is half an hour just to rescue everything. Ensure you guide, but they do, for example, the data collection and the analysis, and the rephrasing and the reworking and the writing, so that they can continue to do this after they graduate. There's no point in doing everything for them, even though it might be tempting, because they then won't actually be able to do another piece of research after they've left you. So it's tough to enable our students to be able to do everything that's necessary in conducting and writing up a good research project. But it's better that we do that and give them models and put them in touch with other people than that we do it for them. Don't write their thesis. Put them in touch with regulations and communities and each other. And many of these time-consuming issues can be solved when they share them with other people, as ours can, when we share them with other supervisors. If there is any mental health and well-being support available, then share it with each other. These issues of mental health support and well-being need to be embedded right from the start and understood by whatever system you've got in your university, a doctoral college or whatever organisation relates to students and supervisors, and sustained. And I think we're quite often the poor relations in this, because we're also seen, I think, quite often as the servants or as the unquestionable knowledge sources, as if we know all the answers. Well, we don't. Every project's different, every student's different. But we're not the poor relations in a system which is only working to support, if it is, the well-being of the students. I think we need to be looked after too, and to look after each other and to look after ourselves. so that we can do our best work, so that the students can do their best work. So some of this engagement with sound practices can be enabled through workshops and regulations, open discussions, and supervisors and on the college or the university planning together and remaining in touch, so that we're not alone in trying to work out how to deal with lack of progress, lack of communication, and various other crises which can hold up and undermine both our work and that of the students, and therefore the university reputation. I think universities need to wake up and take a little bit more responsibility here. So we're not the Wizard of Oz. We can't solve everything. We don't have magical strength and all the answers, and perhaps that's one of the causes of stress too. So here's some research-based suggestions at three levels: an individual level, a university level, and an us level. While we're busy demystifying the research learning journey and supporting our students in their research processes and practices, we need to make explicit and focus for ourselves on healthy behaviours for a sound supervisory experience. This is where the dog comes in, but you will have your own ways of doing this as well. We're not surgeons. We can't fix many of the problems our students' work shows, but we can help diagnose these problems, make some suggestions so they can take control, and offer some models. At a university level, we need written support and people to turn to discuss the issues that we as supervisors face in balancing the workload and being too tied up with the individual students. Do you have anybody to turn to? And we also need to develop a set of sustainable well-being and mental health support practices. And they should be embedded in the regulations and the norms of the institution, with somebody in a well-being team dedicated to support us as supervisors. There should be some published and shared procedures for time management, because that's one of the greatest things that causes such hassle and stress for us. And opportunities in workshops and regular supervisory meetings to share issues and share ways forward, so you're not alone. And at a community level, we need to learn and share good supportive practices with each other. So at the place where I established this community group, we fully shared what we were doing, the problems and the successes we were having, and the strategies that work, so that people who've been doing this for a long time were advising new supervisors, and new supervisors were coming up with some new solutions as well. And I remember that with fondness, because that's the only time that's ever happened, really, apart from in supervisory workshops that I do with new supervisors, where people are explaining how complex this is, and showing their problems that they've got with their first students. And at those points, people do discuss what's helped them as well as what's stressed them. And I think those moments of sharing, as well as reading about um, your own well-being and how you can balance your workload with well-being, are all important ways forward for us. So we've got a range of roles, and this needs to be sustainable. And you might be wondering, when you're in a particularly dark place, if you're professional enough or intelligent enough or flexible enough to deal with all the issues that your one student or your many students produce, while you're also balancing those other demands on your time, since we're not just supervising, we're also doing research and leading project groups and writing and managing other daily activities, including perhaps also undergraduate teaching, conferences, our own publications, and maybe management roles. All of these things we're juggling. And the engagement with the student and their project is, for many people, absolutely key and central. It certainly is for me, because that's my main role. But I'm also trying to publish, and I'm also trying to deliver at conferences. And it's the juggling, I guess, is part of being a researcher and part of being a supervisor. It's quite terrifying, though, when everything backs up on you. So it's about managing, writing things down, seeking support, sharing successful practices. And I think communities help that element of sustainable good practice. So be thinking, who can you turn to? Who are the co-supervisors that you work with well? Who are the people that supervise elsewhere in another country, perhaps on another time zone, that you can share good ideas with? Who can you learn from? Who can you turn to? And how can you cope with some of these pressures that individual students produce, that we naturally internalize, so that we can do our jobs well, but also be healthy and happy ourselves. And okay, so at this point, what we want to do is to ask you to go into some groups in order to process that enormous downpouring of information and ideas and provocations that I've just shared with you, by thinking about three cases. Two of the cases are supervisors, and one of them is a student who is causing the supervisor some stresses. So we're going to ask you to go into breakout rooms, and
Thanks, everyone. Looks like we're back. I'm going to pass it back to Gina, who's going to help us sort of unpack a little bit about what happened in your breakout rooms. Over to you, Gina.
Well, the room that I was in was really very rich, and I couldn't possibly sum it up. But we definitely finally got onto thinking more about the supervisors balancing things. So I'd be really interested to hear maybe about just one point that came out that was definitely supervisor focused from each of the groups. So what have we learned about actions that could support supervisor well-being? Because we're all really very focused on the students, and we kind of suddenly remember that has an impact on us. So perhaps somebody from one of the groups just to say something quite quickly about what you did when you focused on the supervisor well-being.
Yep. So if folks can raise a hand, we can find you and then open your mic.
Michelle?
Thank you. Something that came up in our group, and we had a great group of people from across the country, was the difficulty for untenured faculty or new supervisors to know who and when to approach for help, even if they have a co-supervisor who's to be their support. So I think recognizing that our early career scholars, whether they're tenured or not, our early career scholars are very vulnerable and have a lot of self-doubt. So they may need some intentional efforts from their more senior colleagues to ensure that they've got the help and resources that they need.
Yep. Great, thank you. Somebody from one of the other two groups? Don't be shy. Sarah, go on then. Thank you.
In our group, we talked about a lot of different things, but some of the ones that supported the research advisor were when things are maybe not going well, trying how to communicate those boundaries that we might have on our time or when we're available, and just have clear communication throughout. So to stick to those boundaries if we put them up, to indicate that so that students are aware of that, and that can actually help students then work within those parameters, providing clear guidelines to the student about how progress is expected, and then if things are not maybe working well, have some maybe more committee meetings, have kind of smaller goals for the student to meet smaller steps rather than this big ambiguous project. But I think a lot of it was how to communicate better,
Yeah. And you also mentioned boundaries, which came up in the other group too. So if you're focusing how this helps you do your job and you remain well, then these boundaries and these bits of time management, as well as having these specifically focused meetings with small goals, will help everybody structure. I mean, we all start out thinking we're doing this, but it seems to slip. Thank you. Third group. Two participants raised their hands. So there's another Sarah and there's James. Let's ask James for a minute then.
Okay. Our group, we focused on case 3, and we ended up talking a bit about expectations, how to manage expectations. So in our scenario, the professor was feeling overwhelmed, trying to get away on holiday, working on the weekend, and continually being called upon. So we talked about how kind of developing clear expectations, at the outset. One of my reflections, so kind of going beyond what the group said, but one of my reflections were around the process that you initially set up with the student, whether it's kind of informal or formal. If you have a bit more of a formal structure from the beginning, that can kind of help manage expectations so everyone's clear about it. over time, sometimes people forget because we become familiar with each other. So you sometimes maybe just have to have reminders so that those expectations are reestablished, or friendly, you remember that they were there. So anyway, expectations is our kind of big thing, because that kind of then all connects into time management and what we, think we'll be getting out of each other.
Yeah, thank you. And that came up also in the group that I was in, about boundaries and people doing writing their responses, but putting them on some kind of time clock so that they don't go out till Monday morning, but certainly not responding all the way through the weekend, because that will set up an expectation of you always being there to do so. Sarah, you've got your hand up as well. Sarah Rekhammer.
Oh, that was a mistake somehow.
Okay, fair enough.
There was a good document shared by Anne in our group of setting, like a document that he has his students sign, which I thought was also a really good idea of kind of setting out some of these expectations, and then having that communication be in written form as well.
Yeah, a kind of learning contract. That's a term for them. So I mean, the more formal you can be, where you're actually having explicit discussions about when people can get in touch, what people can expect from each other, and revisiting them in a kindly fashion, I think the less you're constantly going to be feeling guilty that you haven't tended to their needs, and that then really kind of makes you feel unwell and not well. So that's great. So there were a couple of other things that I heard that came up, and one of them was that it is, and I've actually always thought this because I've had lots of postgrad lodgers. It's not enough to have the postgrads, but I also have had them in the house, international ones, that people work in labs who work already in a group, have got a community that is sort of set up there to help support some of these needs. So it isn't always the supervisor as leader who does that. So the group that I went in talked about the lab life and the meetings that they had, and I wondered whether that was also something that we might be able to copy somehow, even though we're not working around in the same room together, but bringing people together in a tea room, or bringing them together so that they naturally develop some kind of community like students do in labs. Any other tips that anybody came up with in their group that they could briefly share that will help the sustainability of sound supervisor well-being practices? We've got all sorts of things that you have just shared about getting it right from the start and not being there all the time, and having others. Anything else? Russell? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that was interesting about the first case study was the interaction with the co-supervisor. And I think that at McGill, our dean has actually done a lot of good for creating tools for students to use, to kind of empower them to take more charge of their degrees. We've worked very hard to create a lot of resources for students to support them. We recently just gave a leadership forum discussion of trying to develop a culture of shared supervision amongst supervisors, and trying to get our supervisors to think about each other and to kind of be there for students who are afraid to talk to their supervisors. And I think that it's something that is actually I've been an associate dean for about 4.5 years now, and this is the first thing where we find it very challenging, actually, because obviously in every department there are people that are available to students regardless. The people whose doors are open even post-COVID, trying to keep my door's always open except when I'm in Zoom meetings like this. So the idea is just so anybody can come by, but not just for my students but my colleagues. But it just seems that we're at McGill, we're having this is our biggest obstacle right now, is that supervisors will have problems with supervisors and students, and you go to the chair and the chair knows, and the colleagues know, but then no one seems to really do anything about it. And I don't know if it would be great to hear if especially for you, Gina, if in your research, if you kind of understand, are there ways in which are there good mechanisms that the university can implement or supports to encourage this kind of teamwork amongst colleagues, really, because I think that like developing this respect for colleagues and getting us to work together to help students will have a net benefit for everybody.
I mean, some of that, I've never really worked anywhere since that first place that I was talking about, where we worked as a community. But some of that is about making it explicit that we can work together, and we should find time to meet together in a kind of relaxed fashion to talk about what's working with our students, so that everybody, particularly new supervisors, feels that they are supported and they can have those conversations with more established supervisors. So I think a community activity, even having a joint tea room, but that sort of expects us to have an environment where everybody's in. And you mentioned COVID, and I think since COVID, certainly in the UK, not everybody's in anymore. There isn't a door to knock on, and even if you're in a large shared room and you've all got a desk in it, it's pretty well empty. Whenever I go back to Bath, it's like me and one other person, and 45 empty seats. And I'm thinking this is an opportunity for people to sit together, the spaces that have been created, to talk about their students in a positive developmental fashion, but that they're not in. So I think we have to get over the crisis of not being in, and maybe make ways of meeting online in communities to talk to each other and actually time them in, and make it an expectation that supervisors do that right from the start, like we're making an expectation for students to behave in certain ways from the start. Because if we know that we can helpfully support each other and explain and own up to problems and how we dealt with them, then and share these issues, then I think we ought to build on that. But I don't actually know anywhere where that happens. Actually, I do. It's Sweden, where they meet together a lot. University of Gothenburg, where I had a long relationship. They would all meet and they'd have high-level conversations and they'd pass good tips between each other, and the doctoral students were there as well. So that kind of atmosphere, I think, well, that was normalized, and that was amazing.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the great ideas, all of you, and also for some of the examples of things that were working about managing your time and getting people to share good practice with each other. Okay, so I think we're moving on towards the last bit, which doesn't really do justice to all the good ideas that you just shared, but it's a few other things that came up out of the research or out of experience to share with you and get you to think about. So I'll move on to that, if that's okay. So there's a couple of resources, and I've put the links to them in the end. So normally I just pile through the references and say, and there's some references, but I'll pause over them because I've highlighted the two things that you can easily get access to if you want to. So from these two bits of work, Charlotte and I produced, from the first one, a couple of toolkits, and the supervisor toolkit from the Troublesome Encounters research project, which lasted for 3 years, and doctoral students kept diaries, and we interviewed them, and doctoral supervisors, we interviewed them, and examiners, we interviewed them. And that was a project that built on another project where we interviewed all those people, but differently and not about wellness. This produced a toolkit which isn't really for supervisors to look after themselves, but if it's for them to support their students, then it takes some of the stress off what you're actually doing as a supervisor. So I'm going to suggest that you have a look at that, and it is in the references. And the other one that's in the references is the article that Jill and I wrote in 2016, which identifies that about supervisor well-being and about our well-being being tied up with the students' well-being and the students' progress. So the more we can enable them to get on with it by structured working and by also an atmosphere of being able to talk about stress and to be able to talk about being stuck and how you handle it, the more we will ourselves be able to cope with our own well-being and feel successful in the progress of our students. So being explicit, sharing things, having the conversations, working together, I think are helpful. But anyway, also we're researchers, so we read research, so there's these two things. So we're thinking a bit, first of all, from the Troublesome Encounters project. And there was a section on academic well-being in this report that has these grids attached to it. And it was aimed at both students and supervisor. And what's the supervisors identify the following areas as being crucial to research student well-being and the research students fulfilling their academic potential. And then also tangentially at that point, how it relates to us as supervisors. So things that we all need: health, a sense of security in what they're doing, an ability to cope with stress. So finding things that help you manage the stress and manage your time, dog walking again, but other things, and being comfortable in the process of learning and not panicking and not feeling you're not doing well enough, but actually finding those strategies where you congratulate yourself for the few things that you have done today. And don't beat yourself up for the others that you didn't manage to do as well as you could have done. So that kind of practice, which I think we also need to instill in our students. And it's essential at the core of this is to establish for us a balance between providing support and ensuring the students develop as independent learners, where they won't need us as support, they won't need us as substitute parents or substitute editors or substitute writers. And then we can see them developing and making decisions themselves, and that actually makes us feel better balanced and more healthy, and that we're doing our job well. So I think the questions at the bottom: how far should well-being be the student's own responsibility as opposed to that of the supervisors in the institution, should be matched with this one: how far should supervisor well-being be the responsibility of the individual or the institution? I'm going to just answer that and say I think institutions need to step up and offer some more support and community building, and recognise that it is a very stressful job. I think even when people are doing a lot of it, they forget how taxing it is to get to know the learning processes and the development trajectory of each individual student when they're doing something so unknown. And it's unknown for us to actually work with the thing that they're working with. So these sorts of things about academic well-being came out the first piece of work. And the other thing I wanted to share with you is optimal functioning. We all got quite excited about this the other day. Optimal functioning, how and when do you know you're doing your best work? And also, what are the challenges that seem to prevent you from doing that? The troublesomeness that research students experience, which is intellectually and emotionally demanding, and how they develop emotional resilience through community belonging and positive relationships and well-being strategies, etc. And then what does that have implications for us? How are we aware of ways to support our own optimal functioning? If their success is tied up in our sense of success and well-being, what can we do to enable their success and our success with them, and on other things obviously too, and our sense of well-being? So what are the strategies that work for you? And we've said communities, organizing, managing expectations, and managing time and availability, but also making things clear for the students so that they can be less dependent and can make the decisions themselves, so less dependent on us, so we're not constantly on call and feeling that they're making no progress. So we need to be aware of and support for our own optimal functioning. So I'm going to bring in Maslow at this point in a minute. Boundaries, you said all this, support infrastructures. We too can become ill with stress. I definitely see supervisors burning out. Yes, we're tied up with their well-being. We've said all this. So factors which contribute positively to research supervisor well-being, which are also useful for students then: a positive learning environment, a sound supportive academic culture for academic and personal balance. I'd like to see at Bath people using the lovely upstairs room that we can all get together, because while we're also eating our sandwiches, we can share some of the stuck places that we're in with our students, and also how we got over the last stuck place. And therefore, people then feel positively supported, and they're going to feel more self-actualized in their work as supervisors because they're being successful. Welfare needs being met, community belonging, and positive supervisory relationships between co-supervisors and committees. So finding time to get to know your co-supervisor and the rest of the committee so that you can support each other. Even if you've got a shy co-supervisor, they will have things to offer that you can share with each other, and it's also someone to talk to about the student being stuck or how well they're moving on with their trajectory. Developing some strategies for empowerment and student engagement to reduce the dependence then and to enhance their motivation and ownership. I mean, the next research project they're going to do, they're probably going to do on their own or with a completely new group of researchers. They do need to develop independence and reduce dependence. And then that takes that stress and strain off us and we can watch them go on and be good models. But if they are constantly asking for more time and constantly worrying about the unknownness of the journey, and we're constantly worrying about that, we're not enabling them to fly on their own. And we're also having quite a bad time trying to work out what to do to support them and feeling that we're lacking. So strategies for empowerment, strategies to get communities together, discussing with other supervisors, actually being aware that this is a job and it affects our health and satisfaction and our sense of achievement, as well as our sense of well-being. So our sense of well-being is tied up with our own achievement through the students and the students' achievement. So the more we can help structure it and support each other through this, the better everyone's going to feel and the better outcomes. And so some other things at the bottom then with cultural awareness, being aware that different students from different contexts are going to produce different issues and the strangenesses of working in a different cultural context. 90% of my students are not from the UK, so this is always an issue. But yeah, it's wonderful, it's rich, but it's about trying to find out about how somebody else thinks and writes and some of the things that might be making them stuck that I will have to help them get unstuck about so that I can feel unstuck. And developing academic confidence in what you're doing and feeling, how can you celebrate when a student's doing well? And how can you celebrate when you've turned around a student who's got stuck? So feeling good about what we're doing as supervisors and congratulating ourselves, but also making note about the steps that helped us get there. And a culture and a personal practice and of self-actualization. So if we think, you all know about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I'm sure that it's a triangle, and at the bottom we need to feel comfortable and safe and secure. So behaving in a healthy manner, managing your time, managing these relationships right at the bottom will enable us to be self-actualized at the top of this triangle, where we're feeling we're doing our good work and we're feeling rewarded by it and moving on. And that is through the students' development, but it also kicks back in our sense of achievement. So looking after yourself, being very organized, communities, working together, and occasionally saying to yourself when a student's moved on a bit, well done, and what did I do that helped make that work? So those are some of the things that I wanted to round off with. And I also wanted to ask you some questions, but I'm just going to share final reflection then, that we want to ensure that academic well-being for supervisors is sustainable in the university, or at least taken seriously and then eventually sustainable. And there's lots of things to do with planning and community, and I've said all of those. I just wanted to focus for a moment on these two things that you might want to follow up, and then I'm going to ask for some final questions in the last couple of minutes. So the Morris and Wisker Escalate report, Troublesome Encounters, has got some interesting grids you might look at. Things that people said that have worked to solve problems that they've identified. And then the the article on supervisor wellbeing and identity from 2016, I've got the link at the bottom of that as well. I think you're going to get the slides. Is that right?
Yes, Gina, everything's in the chat, your article, the link to the Troublesome Encounters, and your slides.
So, because we're researchers, we might want to look back at some of this as well as remember some of the great things that people said. I'm going to stop this and ask for some last questions and thoughts.
I don't mind saying, Gina, thank you for this focus on supervisor well-being. Even in our group with very esteemed scholars from across the country, the first thing we did was focus on the students, which I think is a real key of our commitment to students. Talking about supervisor well-being doesn't come as naturally maybe, and it really should. And I really like your focus on creating productive and well institutional cultures to support supervisor well-being. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and noticing around you things that look as though they're working. Where are there groups of supervisors talking to each other who look happy and healthy? What are they doing right? So learning from success. So that the best community experience that I had was way back at Anglia Ruskin in the early 2000s, because we came together as a community. We also took the students away because they had to meet in groups outside the country, and we got to trust each other that way and see what was working. So if you read some of the stuff that we've done and you think back on what's been successful in your own practice. Any other thoughts or questions?
Exciting things happening. We're establishing a national community of practice with Michelle and others across the country. We can connect you with Gina if you like, but we just want to really thank Gina so very much for being our inaugural workshop and for allowing us to focus on your well-being, because we feel that supervisors really matter. So thanks, everybody. We hope we see you next time.